Have you ever wondered why the Son of God, the creator of the universe, needed to pray? Today we're diving deep into how did Jesus pray, and what we discover might challenge everything you thought you knew about prayer. What makes this exploration truly extraordinary is that we're not just looking at prayer from a religious perspective. Instead, we're uncovering the intimate moments of Jesus' prayer life that have been overlooked by many scholars and believers for centuries. In fact, what I'm about to share with you comes from an extensive study of not just the Gospels, but also historical documents, ancient Jewish prayer practices, and archaeological findings that shed new light on Jesus' prayer locations and patterns. To bring you this comprehensive understanding, I've spent years researching through original Greek texts, consulting with biblical scholars and analyzing historical records from the first century. This isn't just another discussion about prayer. It's a deep dive into how the most influential figure in history communicated with God, backed by scholarly research and historical evidence. Mezzanine. By the end of this video, you'll gain much more than just knowledge about how Jesus prayed. You'll learn a transformative approach to prayer that can revolutionize your spiritual life. Practical techniques that Jesus used, which you can implement immediately. The hidden principles behind Jesus' most powerful prayers. A clear, step-by-step framework for developing a prayer life that actually works in our modern world. This isn't just about learning history. It's about discovering a way of prayer that could transform your relationship with God just as profoundly as it did for Jesus' first followers. Whether you're just starting your spiritual journey or you've been praying for years, what you're about to learn will give you a new perspective on how to connect with God in a deeper, more meaningful way. Let's begin this extraordinary journey into understanding how Jesus prayed, and, more importantly, how we can learn to pray like Him. Part 1. Understanding Jesus' Prayer Foundation. Understanding Jesus' prayer foundation takes us back to a pivotal moment in biblical history, the early days of Jesus' ministry in Galilee. Picture this. The sun hasn't yet risen over the Sea of Galilee, its waters still dark and silent. The small fishing village of Capernaum sleeps, except for one figure moving quietly through the narrow streets. It's Jesus, fresh from a day where he had healed countless sick people, including Simon Peter's mother-in-law. The previous evening had been chaotic, with what seemed like the entire town gathering at Peter's door, bringing their sick and demon-possessed. The Gospel of Mark tells us that the whole city was gathered together at the door, Mark 1:33. The pressure was immense, the demands overwhelming. Anyone else might have used these precious pre-dawn hours for much need. But Jesus had a different priority. Mark 1:35 reveals something extraordinary. And rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. This wasn't a casual decision or a one-time event. The Greek text uses the imperfect tense, suggesting this was his regular practice, a foundation of his ministry that would become increasingly significant. To truly understand the weight of this moment, we need to consider the historical context. In first-century Judaism, prayer was highly structured, often performed at set times in the temple or synagogues. But Jesus' approach was radically different. He sought solitude, choosing a desolate place, in Greek eremontopon, the same phrase used to describe the wilderness where he faced his initial temptation. What makes this even more fascinating is what happened next. When his disciples finally found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Mark 1:37. The opportunity for instant fame and influence was right there. The crowds were waiting. The momentum was building. Any religious leader looking to establish their ministry would have rushed back to capitalize on this moment. Any defense of the great. But Jesus' response was unexpected and profound. "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." Mark 1:38. This decision, made in the quiet hours of prayer, would set the course for his entire ministry. This wasn't just about finding a quiet moment for spiritual reflection. Jesus was demonstrating something revolutionary about the very foundation of prayer. In the original Greek text, the word used for prayed is prosoucheto, indicating continuous, intimate communion. This wasn't a mere religious duty or a morning ritual. It was a vital connection with the Father that shaped every decision, every action, every response to the demands pressing in from all sides. The archaeological evidence from Capernaum reveals that the desolate place Jesus chose was likely in the hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee. From this vantage point, he could see the fishing boats setting out for the morning catch, the first stirrings of life in the village below. Yet he chose this moment, this place, for something more essential than even his healing ministry: communion with his Father. This foundation of prayer wasn't built on obligation but on relationship. The Gospel of John gives us deeper insight into this connection when Jesus says, "The Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing." John 5:19. Every miracle, every teaching, every strategic decision flowed from these moments of intimate prayer. What's particularly striking is how this pattern would intensify during the most crucial moments of his ministry. Luke's Gospel notes that before choosing his 12 disciples, Jesus spent the entire night in prayer. Luke 6:12. Before the Transfiguration, he was praying, and in Gethsemane, facing his greatest trial, he returned to this foundation of prayer with such intensity that his sweat became like drops of blood. The climax of understanding Jesus' prayer foundation comes in John 17, in what's known as the high priestly prayer. Here we see the culmination of this lifetime of intimate communion with the Father. The prayer reveals the depth of relationship that had been built through countless pre-dawn conversations, mountaintop vigils, and quiet moments of connection. This foundation of prayer wasn't just a spiritual discipline, it was the very heartbeat of Jesus' relationship with the Father, the source of his power, and the guide for his ministry. It challenges our modern notions of prayer as merely a means to an end or a religious duty to be fulfilled. As we move forward to examine Jesus' specific prayer patterns, we must remember that these patterns grew from this profound foundation of relationship. In our next segment, we'll explore how Jesus' example teaches us to develop our own prayer patterns that go beyond mere ritual to touch the heart of God. But first, let's pause to consider, if Jesus, who was one with the Father, felt the need for such deep, consistent prayer, how much more do we need to build this same foundation in our own spiritual lives? His example shows us that true prayer isn't about the words we say or the time we spend. It's about the relationship we build and the transformation that follows. Part 2. Learning from Jesus' prayer patterns. Let me take you back to a morning in ancient Galilee, long before the sun had risen over the hills surrounding Capernaum. The year was around 28 AD, and the previous day had been one of the most demanding in Jesus' ministry. Picture this. The narrow streets of Capernaum had been packed with people seeking healing, deliverance, and hope. The Gospel of Mark tells us that the whole town had gathered at the door. Mark 1:33. But what happened next reveals something profound about Jesus' prayer patterns that would change our understanding of spiritual discipline forever. In the depths of that night, while the city still slept, Jesus quietly rose from his rest. Mark's account tells us, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place, where he prayed. Mark 1:35. Imagine the scene, the cool morning air, the absolute silence broken only by his footsteps on the rocky path. The stars still visible in the pre-dawn sky. This wasn't a one-time occurrence, it was a pattern that defined his ministry. What makes this moment particularly fascinating is its context. The previous evening had been a triumph by any standards. Jesus had healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law, then proceeded to heal many others who were sick with various diseases. By modern standards, this would have been the perfect time to capitalize on his success, to build momentum. Instead, He chose solitude and prayer. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While Jesus was in prayer, Simon Peter and the others began searching frantically for him. The Greek word used in Mark's Gospel, katadidioko, suggests an intense pursuit, almost like hunting. When they finally found him, their words revealed the stark contrast between human agenda and divine priority. Everyone is looking for you, Mark 1:37. But no one saw the man. This moment perfectly illustrates the first crucial pattern in Jesus' prayer life, the priority of timing. He consistently chose the early morning hours, what the ancient Jews called the fourth watch, between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Historical records from the first century tell us this was considered a sacred time, when the veil between heaven and earth was thought to be thinnest. But Jesus' prayer patterns weren't just about timing. Let's move forward in his ministry to another pivotal moment. Luke 6:12 records that before choosing his 12 apostles, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. This wasn't just a brief retreat, it was an all-night vigil that would shape the future of Christianity. The location Jesus chose is significant. The mountains around the Sea of Galilee, where this likely took place, rise about 1,500 feet above sea level. Archaeological studies have identified several potential prayer spots that align with biblical descriptions, secluded areas with natural rock formations that provided shelter while offering a clear view of the surrounding landscape. These weren't random choices. They were strategic selections that facilitated deep, uninterrupted communion with God. The pattern of seeking elevated, solitary places for prayer wasn't unique to Jesus. It was deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. Moses received the law on Mount Sinai, Elijah encountered God on Mount Horeb, and the temple itself was built on Mount Moriah. Jesus was intentionally connecting his prayer life to this rich spiritual heritage while establishing a new pattern for his followers. But perhaps the most poignant example of Jesus' prayer patterns emerges in the Garden of Gethsemane. Here we see the culmination of all his prayer patterns coming together in his moment of greatest need. The Gospel accounts tell us that this was his usual place, Luke 22:39, suggesting a pattern of regular retreat to this specific location. The garden, situated on the Mount of Olives, offered both privacy and proximity, close enough to the city to be accessible, yet far enough for genuine solitude. The intensity of this moment reveals another crucial pattern, the duration and depth of his prayers. In Gethsemane, Luke tells us that Jesus prayed so fervently that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground, Luke 22:44. This wasn't a casual conversation. It was deep, persistent, transformative prayer. These patterns, early morning timing, elevated and solitary locations, and extended duration, weren't arbitrary choices. They were intentional practices that created the optimal conditions for intimate communion with God. Jesus understood that prayer wasn't just about the words spoken, but about creating the space and time for genuine connection with the Father. As we transition to understanding how these patterns can transform our own prayer lives, consider this. If Jesus, who was in perfect union with the Father, saw the need for such intentional prayer practices, how much more do we need to be mindful of when, where, and how long we pray? The question isn't just about copying Jesus' external patterns, but about understanding the profound wisdom behind them. In our next segment, we'll explore how these physical patterns reflected something even deeper, the very heart of Jesus' relationship with the Father. But for now, let's pause to consider, how might your own prayer life change if you began to implement these time-tested patterns of the Master himself? This careful examination of Jesus' prayer patterns reveals more than just historical facts. It provides us with a blueprint for transformative prayer that has stood the test of time. As we prepare to dive deeper into the heart behind these patterns, remember that Jesus wasn't just teaching us how to pray. He was showing us how to live in constant communion with God. Part 3. the heart behind Jesus' prayers, a journey into the Garden of Gethsemane. Picture yourself in ancient Jerusalem on a cool spring evening during the Feast of Passover around 33 AD. The narrow streets are quieting down after the bustling celebrations, and a small group of men makes their way through the eastern gate of the city. Leading them is Jesus of Nazareth, who knows that this night will change human history forever. The moon casts long shadows as Jesus and his disciples approach the Garden of Gethsemane, a familiar olive grove where he often retreated to pray. The air is heavy with the scent of olive blossoms, and the ancient trees, some hundreds of years old, stand as silent witnesses to what's about to unfold. These very trees had likely provided shade for King David himself when he fled from Absalom centuries before. But tonight is different. The atmosphere is charged with tension. Jesus, who has spent 3 years performing miracles and teaching with unmatched authority, now shows a side of himself that reveals the very essence of his prayer life, his profound humanity intertwined with his divine nature. Historical records and archaeological findings suggest that this garden was a commercial olive press, which adds deeper meaning to its name Gethsemane, meaning oil press in Aramaic. Just as olives were crushed to produce precious oil, Jesus was about to experience intense spiritual and emotional pressure that would reveal the heart of his relationship with the Father. As Jesus moves deeper into the garden, he does something unprecedented. He, who had always been the pillar of strength for others, begins to show signs of deep distress. The Greek words used in the original text, ekthambio and ademonio, suggest a state of profound anguish and terror that's almost impossible to translate fully into English. This wasn't just anxiety. This was psychological and spiritual agony of the highest magnitude. He takes his closest friends, Peter, James, and John, a little further with him. These are the same disciples who witnessed his transfiguration on the mountain, who saw his glory. Now they would witness his vulnerability. The contrast is striking and intentional. Jesus wants us to understand that true prayer encompasses both mountaintop experiences and valley moments. Then comes the moment that reveals everything about Jesus' heart in prayer. Falling face down on the ground, a posture of complete submission in Jewish tradition, he begins to pray. His words, preserved in multiple gospel accounts, give us unprecedented insight into his prayer life. Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. The use of Abba, an intimate Aramaic term similar to daddy, shows the deep personal connection Jesus maintained even in his darkest hour. This wasn't formal, ritualistic prayer. This was raw, honest communion with a trusted Father. Historical context reveals that this kind of intimate address to God was revolutionary in Jewish prayer tradition. As Jesus prays, we see 3 fundamental aspects of his heart in prayer. First, complete honesty. He doesn't hide his desires or fears, but brings them openly before God. The cup he speaks of represents not just physical death, but the spiritual horror of bearing the world's sin and experiencing separation from the Father, something he had never known in eternity. Second, absolute trust. Even in his anguish, Jesus never doubts God's power. Everything is possible for you, or goodness. This trust wasn't blind faith, but was built on a lifetime of intimate communion with the Father. Third, ultimate surrender. The phrase, "not my will but yours," becomes the climax of the prayer and reveals the core of Jesus' heart, complete alignment with the Father's purposes, even at devastating personal cost. The intensity of this moment is captured in Luke's account, which records that Jesus' sweat became like drops of blood, a rare medical condition called hematidrosis, occurring under extreme stress. This physical manifestation of his spiritual struggle shows us that earnest prayer can be costly, involving our whole being, body, soul, and spirit. What makes this scene even more poignant is that Jesus prays this prayer 3 times. Each time he returns to find his disciples sleeping, highlighting the solitary nature of his deepest prayers. Yet he doesn't berate them harshly but shows compassion, understanding the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. As the scene reaches its climax, we see the transformation that true prayer brings. When Jesus rises from prayer the final time, he is no longer in anguish but filled with resolute purpose. His prayer hasn't changed the circumstances, the cross still awaits, but it has aligned his human will perfectly with the divine will. This moment in Gethsemane teaches us that prayer isn't about changing God's mind, but about aligning our hearts with his purposes. It shows us that we can bring our raw emotions, our fears, and our desires to God, yet still surrender to his greater wisdom. As we transition from this powerful scene, we begin to understand that prayer isn't just about words or rituals, it's about bringing our whole heart before God. This understanding leads us to a crucial question: how can we practically implement these principles in our own prayer lives? Let's explore how Jesus' example in Gethsemane can transform our daily communion with God. Part 4. Practical application for modern life. The Garden's lesson. In the dim light of dawn on a crisp morning in Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago, Jesus made his way through the narrow streets toward the Mount of Olives. This wasn't just any morning, it was a Thursday, mere hours before his arrest, and Jesus knew exactly what lay ahead. The Gospel of Luke tells us that this was his custom, to retreat to this particular garden called Gethsemane, a place whose name literally means olive press. Picture this: the ancient olive trees, their gnarled trunks twisted by centuries of growth, stood as silent witnesses to countless prayers. The ground beneath, stained with the oil of crushed olives, served as a poignant metaphor for what was about to unfold. Here, in this garden, where olives were literally pressed to extract their precious oil, Jesus himself would experience the greatest pressing of his soul. But why this place? Why this particular pattern? The answer lies in understanding the deeper significance of Jesus' prayer habits. Historical records tell us that the Mount of Olives stood exactly 1 Sabbath day's journey from Jerusalem, the maximum distance Jews were permitted to walk on the Sabbath. This wasn't a coincidence. Jesus, in his divine wisdom, chose a location that perfectly balanced accessibility with solitude. This pattern reveals something profound about implementing prayer in our modern lives. Just as Jesus chose Gethsemane, a place both accessible yet removed from the bustle of Jerusalem, we too must find our own gardens in today's world. It might be a quiet corner in your home, a local park, or even your car during lunch break. The principle remains the same: creating a space that's both accessible and set apart. But the garden teaches us more. Archaeological findings have shown that Gethsemane was a working garden, a place of commerce and activity during daylight hours. Yet Jesus often came here during the quietest times, early morning or late evening. This wasn't just about finding physical solitude, it was about carving out dedicated time in the midst of a busy life. The intensity of Jesus' prayers in Gethsemane reached its climax on that fateful night before his crucifixion. Luke describes his anguish in vivid detail. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Luke 22, verse 4. This moment teaches us perhaps the most crucial lesson about prayer in modern life: authenticity trumps formality. In our world of carefully curated social media posts and polished public personas, Jesus' raw vulnerability in Gethsemane stands as a powerful reminder. Here was the Son of God, prostrate on the ground, wrestling with the Father's will. No pretense, no religious formality, just pure, honest communion with God. This brings us to the practical application for our modern lives. The pattern Jesus established in Gethsemane gives us 3 crucial principles. First, consistency matters more than duration. Jesus didn't wait for extended periods of free time. He created regular moments for prayer within his busy schedule. In our modern contexts, This might mean setting aside 15 minutes each morning before checking our phones, or taking a prayer walk during lunch break. Second, location can become a catalyst for devotion. Just as Gethsemane became Jesus' regular meeting place with the Father, we need to establish our own prayer spaces. These physical locations can become spiritual anchors in our hectic lives, helping us transition from the chaos of daily life to focused communion with God. Third, authenticity is essential. Jesus' prayers in Gethsemane weren't polished or performative. They were raw and real. In our age of perpetual performance, we need to remember that prayer is about relationship, not presentation. The story of Gethsemane culminates in Jesus' ultimate submission. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Luke 22:42. This moment of surrender, preceded by intense struggle, shows us that real prayer isn't about achieving a state of peaceful meditation. It's about honest dialogue with God, even when that dialogue involves wrestling with His will. As we transition from understanding these principles to implementing them in our daily lives, remember that Jesus' pattern of prayer wasn't just a historical example, it was a practical template for all who would follow Him. The garden's lessons continue to echo through time, showing us how to navigate our own moments of decision, struggle, and surrender through the power of prayer. In our next section, we'll explore how to overcome the specific challenges that often arise when we try to implement these practices in our modern context. But first, let's understand that just as Jesus faced His greatest test in the garden, our own prayer lives often face their greatest challenges in moments of crisis and decision. The garden story reminds us that prayer isn't just a spiritual exercise. It's a lifeline, a source of strength, and a place of transformation. As we learn to apply these ancient patterns to our modern lives, we begin to discover the same power that sustained Jesus through His darkest hour. Part 5. Overcoming Prayer Challenges. Picture this. It's the darkest night in Jerusalem's history. The air is thick with tension in the Garden of Gethsemane, where ancient olive trees cast long shadows under a cold spring moon. Jesus, knowing the weight of what's about to unfold, faces perhaps the most challenging moment of prayer in human history. This wasn't just any garden. Gethsemane sat on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, where for centuries olives had been crushed to produce oil. The symbolism couldn't be more powerful. Just as olives were pressed to yield their precious oil, Jesus was about to experience the ultimate pressing of His soul. Historical records tell us that this garden was likely a familiar spot for Jesus and His disciples, a place where they often retreated from the bustling streets of Jerusalem for prayer and rest. On this particular night, Jesus demonstrates three profound challenges in prayer that every believer faces, and more importantly, how to overcome them. As He falls to His knees, we see the first challenge emerge, the battle between human desires and divine will. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me," He prays, His voice likely trembling with emotion. The Gospel of Luke adds a striking detail. His sweat became like drops of blood, a rare medical condition called hematidrosis that occurs under extreme emotional stress. But what makes this moment particularly powerful is understanding the cultural context. In first-century Jewish tradition, the cup was a powerful metaphor for destiny or divine judgment. When Jesus spoke of this cup, His disciples would have immediately understood the gravity of what He was facing. Historical sources tell us that crucifixion was considered so horrific that even the most hardened Romans avoided discussing it in polite conversation. The second challenge Jesus faces is physical exhaustion during prayer. The Gospel accounts tell us that while Jesus prayed in agony, His closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, kept falling asleep. This wasn't mere drowsiness. They were exhausted from sorrow. Luke chapter 22, verse 45. Here we see a profound truth. Sometimes our biggest prayer challenges come when we're at our weakest, most vulnerable moments. But it's the third challenge that really strikes at the heart of our modern prayer struggles: the feeling of abandonment. Matthew's account reveals that Jesus prayed the same prayer 3 times. Imagine it, the Son of God repeating his prayer, wrestling with silence. This wasn't a sign of doubt, but rather a demonstration of persistent faith in the face of overwhelming circumstances. The climax of this prayer battle comes when Jesus utters those immortal words, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." This wasn't just a resignation to fate, it was a triumphant breakthrough in prayer. Historical context adds another layer here. In ancient Middle Eastern cultures, submission to a father's will wasn't seen as weakness, but as the highest form of honor and strength. This moment in Gethsemane teaches us something revolutionary about overcoming prayer challenges. The victory doesn't always come through changed circumstances, but through transformed hearts. Jesus' prayer wasn't answered by removing the cup. It was answered by providing the strength to drink it. What's particularly fascinating is how this pattern of prayer, challenge, and breakthrough repeats throughout history. From the early church fathers to modern-day believers, the same principles Jesus demonstrated continue to transform lives. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Christians would often gather in gardens or quiet places outside city walls, following Jesus' example of finding sacred spaces for prayer battles. The practical implications for our prayer lives today are profound. When we face our own Gethsemane moments, those times when prayer feels impossible, when heaven seems silent, when our desires clash with God's will, we can follow Jesus' pattern. He showed us that it's okay to be honest about our struggles, to persist in prayer even when we're exhausted, and to ultimately find peace in submission to God's perfect plan. As we transition from understanding these challenges to implementing practical solutions in our daily prayer lives, remember this: the same divine strength that sustained Jesus in Gethsemane is available to us today. The question isn't whether we'll face prayer challenges, but how we'll respond when they come. This leads us perfectly into our next section, where we'll explore how prayer doesn't just overcome challenges, it transforms our entire perspective on life. Just as Jesus emerged from Gethsemane ready to fulfill his divine purpose, our breakthrough in prayer can lead to profound personal transformation. Part 6. The Transformative Power of Prayer, a Journey Through Time. Let me take you back to one of the most pivotal moments in biblical history, a moment that perfectly illustrates the transformative power of prayer. The year was approximately 586 BC, and Jerusalem lay in ruins. The prophet Daniel, exiled in Babylon, faced what seemed like an impossible situation. The Jewish people were scattered, their temple destroyed, and their future appeared hopeless. In his luxurious quarters within the Babylonian palace, Daniel maintained a remarkable prayer routine that would change not only his life, but the course of history. 3 times a day he would climb to his upper chamber, open his windows facing Jerusalem, and kneel in prayer. This wasn't just any prayer. It was a deliberate act of defiance against a royal decree that forbidden worship of any god except King Darius. The biblical account tells us that Daniel's enemies, jealous of his position and influence, had manipulated the king into signing this decree, knowing full well that Daniel would never compromise his prayer life. The stakes were extraordinarily high. Violation meant being thrown into a den of lions. Yet Daniel's response wasn't one of fear or hesitation. The scripture tells us that when he learned of the decree, he continued his practice as he had done previously. But what made Daniel's prayer life so transformative? The answer lies in the profound changes it produced, both in his personal life and in the larger narrative of his people. Historical records and biblical accounts show us that Daniel's prayer routine wasn't merely a religious ritual. It was a transformative practice that shaped his character, influenced his decisions, and ultimately impacted an entire empire. In Daniel chapter 9, we get a glimpse into the depth of his prayer life. During one of his prayer sessions after studying Jeremiah's prophecy about the end of the exile, Daniel engaged in what scholars consider one of the most powerful intercessory prayers in Scripture. His prayer wasn't just words, it was a deep, soul-searching confession on behalf of his people, combined with an earnest plea for God's mercy. The response to this prayer was extraordinary. The angel Gabriel appeared to Daniel with a message that would become one of the most significant prophecies in the Old Testament, the prophecy of the 70 weeks. This wasn't just a personal transformation, it was a moment that would provide hope and direction for generations to come. But the story doesn't end there. Daniel's prayer life had such an impact that it influenced King Darius himself. After the famous incident of the lion's den, where Daniel's faithfulness in prayer led to his miraculous preservation, Darius issued a decree, acknowledging the power of Daniel's God throughout his empire. This was transformation on a national scale, all stemming from one man's committed prayer life. What makes this story particularly relevant for us today is how it demonstrates the three key aspects of prayer's transformative power. First, we see how prayer shapes our perspective. Daniel maintained his heavenly focus despite his earthly circumstances. Second, we observe how prayer influences our decisions. Daniel chose faithfulness over safety. Finally, we witness how prayer impacts our relationships. Daniel's consistent prayer life ultimately influenced those around him, from his fellow exiles to the king himself. The historical context adds another layer of significance to this transformation. Babylon was the superpower of its day, known for its impressive hanging gardens, advanced astronomy, and complex religious systems. Yet in this sophisticated, pluralistic society, it was the simple, consistent prayer life of one man that brought about lasting change. As we transition to understanding how this ancient example applies to our modern lives, consider this. Daniel's situation may seem far removed from our daily experiences, but the principles remain surprisingly relevant. In our own world of competing priorities and challenging circumstances, prayer has the same transformative potential to change our perspective, influence our decisions, and impact our relationships. This brings us to a crucial question: how can we harness this transformative power in our own prayer lives? The answer lies in understanding that transformation through prayer isn't just about the words we say or the time we spend. It's about developing the kind of relationship with God that changes us from the inside out, just as it did for Daniel. The story of Daniel serves as a bridge to our next discussion about how we can practically implement these transformative principles in our own lives. Like Daniel, we too face challenges that seem insurmountable, situations that require divine intervention, and moments where our faith will be tested. The question isn't whether prayer can transform us. History has proven it can. The question is, are we ready to embrace this transformative journey? As we conclude this exploration of prayer's transformative power, let's turn our attention to the practical steps we can take to begin this transformative journey in our own lives. Conclusion: your journey to a deeper prayer life. In the heart of Jerusalem, nearly 2,000 years ago, a small group of disciples gathered in an upper room. The city was still buzzing with whispers of recent events, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and now something extraordinary was about to unfold. These followers of Jesus, who had witnessed his incredible prayer life firsthand, were about to experience the ultimate answer to his high priestly prayer, recorded in John 17. Picture this moment. The disciples gathered in anticipation, their minds likely racing back to all the times they had watched Jesus pray. They remembered the pre-dawn hours when they would find him alone on mountainsides, his quiet confidence after long nights of prayer, and the raw authenticity of his prayers in Gethsemane. These weren't just distant memories. They were living lessons about to bear fruit. The historical context here is crucial. In ancient Jewish tradition, prayer was often structured, formal, and tied to specific times and places. But Jesus had shown them something different, a relationship with the Father that transcended ritual while honoring tradition. The disciples had witnessed this transformation firsthand, from their traditional Jewish understanding to something deeper and more personal. As they waited in that upper room, they might have recalled Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen." They had seen him model this countless times, but now they were about to experience it themselves in a way they never imagined. The story reaches its climax at Pentecost. The Holy Spirit descends, and suddenly these same disciples who had struggled to stay awake during Jesus' prayers in Gethsemane were now filled with a power that transformed their own prayer lives. This wasn't just an historical event, it was the fulfillment of Jesus' prayer in John 17, that they may be one as we are one. This transformation reveals a profound truth about prayer. It's not just about the words we say or the posture we take, but about the relationship we build. The disciples' journey from observers of Jesus' prayer life to participants in intimate communion with God mirrors our own potential journey. Consider Peter, who had witnessed Jesus' transfiguration during prayer but had also failed to pray when it mattered most in Gethsemane. After Pentecost, we find him leading the early church in powerful prayer, healing the sick, and facing martyrdom with the same peace Jesus had shown. This wasn't just a change in behavior, it was a complete transformation of his understanding of prayer. This historical narrative teaches us something vital about our own prayer journey. Just as the disciples moved from watching Jesus pray to experiencing the power of prayer themselves, we too are invited into this transformative journey. The same Spirit that empowered their prayers is available to us today. The journey to a deeper prayer life isn't just about learning techniques or memorizing prayers. It's about following the path Jesus laid out, from ritual to relationship, from obligation to intimacy, from words to presence. The disciples' story shows us that this transformation is possible for anyone willing to take the journey. As we conclude our exploration of Jesus' prayer life, remember that the upper room experience wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The disciples went on to change the world through lives of prayer and power, and that same opportunity stands before us today. Their story becomes our story as we learn to pray like Jesus. This journey of prayer transformation continues today. Whether you're just beginning to explore prayer or have been praying for years, the path to deeper intimacy with God lies before you, just as it did for those first disciples. The question isn't whether such transformation is possible, but whether we're willing to take the journey. Let's carry forward this legacy of transformative prayer. As we implement what we've learned about Jesus' prayer life, we're not just following a historical example, we're participating in a living tradition that has transformed countless lives throughout history. Your journey to a deeper prayer life begins now, building on the foundation laid by Jesus himself and experienced by generations of faithful followers. Remember, the disciples didn't become prayer warriors overnight. It was a journey of small steps, daily choices, and gradual transformation. Your journey may look different, but the destination is the same: a deeper, more authentic connection with God through prayer. As we conclude this exploration, I invite you to take your first step on this transformative journey. The same power that transformed the disciples' prayer lives is available to you today. The question is, are you ready to begin your own upper room experience? This isn't just about learning how to pray, it's about experiencing the kind of relationship with God that Jesus modeled and made possible for all of us. The journey begins with a single step, a single prayer, a single moment of genuine connection with God. The path lies before you, illuminated by the example of Jesus and countless faithful followers throughout history. The time to begin is now. Throughout this exploration of Jesus' prayer life, we've uncovered profound truths that can transform our own approach to prayer. Today, we've learned that prayer isn't just a religious routine, it's a living, breathing relationship with God that can revolutionize our lives just as it did for Jesus and his earliest followers. Let me ask you something that might challenge you. What if the prayer life you've always dreamed of isn't just a distant ideal, but a reality waiting to unfold? What if the very struggles you face in prayer are actually doorways to deeper intimacy with God? Jesus showed us that even in moments of deepest anguish, like in Gethsemane, prayer becomes most powerful when we're most honest with God. The choice lies before you now. Will you continue with prayer as usual, or will you take the bold step toward praying like Jesus did? Will you move beyond the surface level of ritual into the depths of genuine relationship with God? The transformation awaits, but it requires your decision. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this journey. What aspect of Jesus' prayer life resonates most deeply with you? What challenges do you face in your own prayer life? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to take their next step in their prayer journey. If you found value in today's exploration of how Jesus prayed, I invite you to be part of our growing community of believers seeking deeper connection with God. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss our upcoming videos on spiritual growth and biblical insights. Your presence here matters, and together we can encourage each other in our journey of faith. Before you go, take a moment to reflect. How will you implement what you've learned today? Perhaps start with just 5 minutes of intentional prayer tomorrow morning, following Jesus' example of seeking quiet time with the Father. Small steps lead to profound transformations. Thank you for joining me on this powerful journey into understanding how Jesus prayed. Your commitment to growing spiritually inspires me to continue creating content that helps us all draw closer to God. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who might need this message today. Remember, prayer isn't just something Jesus did. It's something He invites us to experience with Him. The same God who heard Jesus' prayers is listening for yours right now. Will you accept the invitation to pray like Jesus? Until next time, may your prayer life become more vibrant and transformative as you follow in the footsteps of Jesus. God bless you, and I'll see you in our next video.